So a little while back, I just happened to spot on the way to a job just a couple of the most beautiful, biggest white pines that I had ever seen, or at least they were worth checking out. They just happened to be right before the river here, and there they are. Okay. The one on the right is the one that I ended up finding and climbing, but there's one in the distant middle left that I spotted while I was up there that I'm definitely going to go back and check out again. But there's a couple of these really nice white pines that were definitely trees just left when they logged the area, because they would have been a little bit too difficult to fell, so now they just kind of stand watch over the poplar and birch that's left. Just found it, and I was worried because the other ones I saw were kind of short, but yeah, buddy. There we go, man. Yeah. That's a nice white pine. Let's go check out the base. Wow. This thing is big. Perfect tree for this video. All right, let's do some talking about Kernmantle ropes. Let's get ready, man. Yeah. What a tree. Good thing I brought 200 feet of rope, baby. All right, now I'm up situated in this beautiful white pine, and I'm so excited to do the final video in this All About Rope series. Today we're going to be talking about Kernmantle ropes. Now, while Kernmantle ropes haven't been in the tree climbing industry for a super long time, the ropes we've been talking about before, like cover dependent ropes and 24 strand ropes, have been around for a while now. Kernmantles haven't quite been used as much, despite the fact that they're used almost universally by every other kind of rope access, whether it be for recreation like rock climbing or canyoneering, or rope access professions, rescue, and like tower access, pretty much anything like that. Those are all going to be Kernmantle ropes, but you don't see them as much in tree climbing, and there's some reason for that, but they do have a really phenomenal fit for certain parts of tree climbing. So Kernmantle ropes are a core dependent rope. So the cover of these ropes, this is Teufelberger KMIII Max. The covers of these ropes only serve to protect and organize the core of the rope. The core is where all of the strength comes from. And in a Kernmantle rope like this, most Kernmantle ropes, they are parallel kind of twisted cores. So they just kind of run and they're loose from each other, and they're just organized by the jacket of the rope. Now, because these are so tightly wound, they stay very round. So when you're running them through hardware like cam descenders, or things like the Rope Runner Pro or the Akimbo, they're not really going to flatten out. They're going to keep that nice, round, firm feeling. Now, another great thing about Kernmantle ropes is that they have the most tightly braided and most number of yarns in their cover. This one, I believe, is either a 48 or 32 strand cover, but it means that it's super smooth. There's very, very little friction across the cover of this rope, which is great for a couple things. One of those things is when you're just pulling up the line with your throw line from the tree, these tend to run a little bit smoother through unions, so it's a little bit easier to pull these ropes through the tree. Also, they are incredibly strong for their size compared to other styles of ropes. So this is an 11 millimeter rope, but I think it's rated for something ridiculous like 7,000 pounds. And in certain configurations, they can be pretty lightweight. We're going to talk about the two. There's unlike the other ropes we've talked about, since they're used by so many different industries and there's so many different things about them, there are a lot of variations of these ropes, going anywhere from like 8 mil, maybe even smaller, 3 mil, all the way up to, I don't know, you could probably find like 3/4 inch Kernmantle ropes, but in the climbing rope for tree climbing, anything between 11 and 13 millimeters. But so there's so many different sizes that you have to choose from. Now we have our 2 different constructions. You can get nylon and polyester. Usually the covers are always going to be polyester, and the core will be either nylon or polyester. Same things as what we talked about from 24 strand ropes. Nylon is going to be stronger and stretchier, but it will absorb more water. So something that's all polyester isn't going to hold quite as much water. The other thing though is Kernmantle ropes, depending on where you find them, are more likely to be dry treated. So despite having a nylon core, you can get dry treated ropes that will not absorb nearly as much water as an untreated nylon cored rope will. Now this Teufelberger KMIII Max is a nylon core and a polyester cover. There are also all kinds of exotic fiber ropes that you can get. They're much more expensive and not really essential for tree climbing ropes, but things like Technora, Kevlar, other things like that, like Sterling Tech 11, some of their canyoning ropes incorporate a lot of those more exotic, high modular fibers. We don't see them as much in tree climbing because we do not see the hazards for them. Those ropes are really great at being heat and burn resistant. While they say cut resistant, it's not the kind of cuts that we're experiencing in tree care. A chainsaw or a silky is going to cut through a Technora rope just as quickly as it will cut through a polyester rope. They're talking about abrasions over edges, like metal edges. Even though trees can be rather abrasive, they're nothing compared to like going over a metal grate or something like that. But again, they're not going to be able to stand up to an actual sharpened edge like a chainsaw or a silky saw. But they're great for like welding or chemicals or certain chemicals they're very resistant to, and situations like that we don't encounter in tree climbing. So they're not really necessary to have those super expensive ropes as like a climbing rope. You'll find them as buck straps and stuff, but they're not really needed for this. So we have our different fibers that we can have in the core. Now typically it is a parallel core. However, there are other variations out there. Yale makes 2 ropes that are Kernmantles, but also have a braided core. This is one of them. This is pretty popular. This is Yale Kernmaster. This is the Bifrost that you can find on Westspur. But this is a polyester core. They also have a nylon core option. But this rope is a braided core. You can see that there a little bit. So the splice I have there is just kind of the same kind of splice you would do for any hollow braid rope, and then the cover is just whipped onto it. So that's the difficult thing about Kernmantles, is there's not very many of them that you can splice. You could splice all of them, but the goal of a splice usually has been to retain about like 90 to 100% of the rope's strength with that splice. But with parallel core Kernmantles, since the cover is organizing the core, it's very hard to splice the core, to splice it in a way that you use the core so that it's very strong with itself. The way that a standard parallel core rope is spliced, which you can find like Teufelberger Drenaline and things like that, is that it's kind of the same as a 16 strand, where it's just buried just straight back into itself, but you still need the cover to organize the core. So you taper the cover and you take out some of the core strands so that it's able to be passed back through itself. But that means that splice isn't, it's much harder to get those splices to be as strong as the rope itself. They will be about as strong as a knot you would tie in the rope, so they're not worse than a knot in the rope. They're usually better than that, at least. But something like this that has a braided core can be spliced in a way that retains 100% of the rope strength, because since the core is braided, it allows it to be, the core to be spliced back through the core, which you can't do with the parallel strands. With parallel strands, you need the cover to kind of act like that finger trap to compress and apply friction to the backberry so that it won't just pull out of itself and become unspliced. So it's much, much harder to splice Kernmantle ropes. Easier if you're doing one that has a braided core, but Yale also sells Scandair, which is a braided core rope, but that I find it a lot harder to splice it in this way and to get the cover to press back over my brummels, because the cover is so much more solid on that rope. The cover is much more pliable on the Kernmaster. Now, other than ease of splicing, the main difference between a braided core rope and a parallel core rope is that parallel core ropes are very, very stiff. You're able to tie knots in them, but they are very rigid. I mean, the first rope I had was Sterling HTP, 11 mil, and that thing was like a wire rope. It was so ridiculously hard to tie and dress knots in that rope. Whereas this KMIII Max is a little bit easier to tie than that, but it's not nearly as dirty as that Sterling rope I had, which the dirtier and more used they get, the more stiffer they will become. So these ropes are super stiff, but whereas ropes like this Kernmaster that have a braided core, they're a little bit more pliable. Scandair is like much tighter, so that one is a little bit harder to tie knots with, but Kernmaster is fantastic. It's very pliable, super light, and super strong. So this is an 11 mil, and I think its breaking strength is right around 7,000 pounds, but it only weighs 5.5 pounds per 100 feet. So this is a ridiculously light rope. Pretty good rope for exploring and doing things like this. The only thing is that since it's a braided, non-stabilized core like we talked about with 24-strand ropes or hybrid-dependent ropes, it will tend to flatten in devices like cam descenders or the rope runner or akimbos. But I love using the rope wrench anyways, so using something like that, you don't notice that issue so much. But also, the more you wear it in, the dirtier it gets, the more it kind of gets broken in. It will resist that flattening quite a bit more. But yeah, that's pretty cool that you can find braided core ropes. Now, the other thing to talk about is the cover. There are several different types of covers that you can get on a Kernmantle rope. There are some pretty unique ones like Teufelberger Dragonfly that has a pretty burly cover that behaves much more like a 24-strand rope. And then there are ones that have a much smoother cover, which is usually what you're looking for when you're getting a Kernmantle rope. So the difference between these two covers, like the Bifrost and this KMIII Max, is that the KMIII Max are all individual strands for the cover. So it gives you a much these feel smoother to me when they just have the individual strands, but they are a little bit less abrasion resistant than something like this Kernmaster that has a paired strand construction. So it's two strands being woven next to each other as if they were one strand, which it's still incredibly smooth, but I just like how these ones feel like Teufelberger Drenaline and KMIII Max. The regular KMIII has paired strands, just like this Bifrost or Kernmaster. But the feel isn't too terribly different. I just think that the single strand construction feels a little bit more premium. Like Teufelberger Drenaline is a 32-strand cover, all single strands. Whereas like something like Samson Mercury is also a 32-strand cover, but they are paired strands braided as if it were like a 16-strand. So it's a little bit coarser, a little bit more abrasion resistant, but they are not very abrasion resistant in terms of like natural crotching. So they're not great for moving rope systems, because if you're doing a lot of removals and you enjoy just natural crotching your rope, they will let's put it this way, they will wear and they'll fuzz up just fine. They'll usually tolerate it pretty good, But the thing that gets really frustrating is with any little nicks and dings in a Kernmantle rope, they become kind of immediately decommissioned, whereas something with a much more burlier cover, like a 16-strand rope, they'll kind of nick and then kind of fuzz up, and they'll be usable and feel the same without being compromised. But like with just like 2 strands being kind of cut or destroyed on a Kernmantle rope, the core is now exposed, the rope does not function properly, and it has to be decommissioned at that point, or cut at the point where you've damaged it and used as 2 shorter strands. So that can be really frustrating. So for that reason, I do not use it for a moving rope system. All of my Kernmantle ropes are used in single rope system pretty much exclusively. So all of my longer ropes are Kernmantle ropes. My 150-foot lines, my 200-foot lines are all Kernmantle ropes, just because they're easier to pull up into the tree, and they work really, really well with moving rope systems. A super smooth premium feel, and they're really strong, so you can go even smaller diameters, like wreck climbing, going down to like an HTP that's like 8 mil or 9 mil is totally acceptable. The only difference is I just like the feeling of a larger rope in my hands, like an 11 mil, which is kind of small for a tree climbing rope, but for a recreational climbing rope, that's pretty big. But yeah, these ropes are just great all around ropes for recreation and for like bigger trees when you're climbing exclusively single rope when you're working. But the other great thing that we'll mention one last time is in terms of low friction, is when you're doing a natural crotch redirect, when you're climbing SRT, like going through a big oak tree or a really spread out maple. The great thing about this cover being so smooth is that you can just drag the tail very easily. So you know what I mean? Just throwing your device through the crotch and then just continuing to rappel and work and just letting your tail be pulled through the crotch by your weight. It goes so much better with a Kernmantle rope as opposed to like a 24-strand rope. It just slips over the wood and over the rope itself just so much smoother, and it's just amazing. Like going through an oak tree and redirecting like 10 different times. Like I've done like trees close to each other where I redirected twice in one oak tree and then jumped into the other oak tree and redirected about 3 more times in that tree, and just for fun to see how many times I could redirect. And going back to the ground, it was no problem pulling that rope out of the tree, and it was no problem just letting my tail drag when I was redirecting. So that's something that I can't get away with like a 16-strand rope or a 24-strand rope. So these are really, really great for that. So when you're looking for a long line, a Kernmantle rope is a phenomenal choice for single rope technique. Some of the things like Drenaline can be used in moving rope systems, but when you're doing that, you're going to want to use a cambium saver just to ease up the wear on the rope, and you'll enjoy that more premium feel of it moving through a pulley saver or a ring saver with such a smooth cover. But these are really fantastic ropes, and they are possible to splice, and I will include a little video of how, just a quick overview on how you splice something like Drenaline. I have a video already on how to splice Kernmaster the way that I splice Kernmaster, so you can check that out. I'll link that here. But yeah, I'll just give you a quick overview of how we splice Drenaline. So a standard parallel core Kernmantle splice like we do on Drenaline. This is not Drenaline, this is the KMIII Max again, but it can be spliced just like Drenaline. It's not as bouncy, so I would not recommend using it for double rope technique, but I had this extra bit laying around, so I decided to splice it. It starts very similar to 16 strand by removing several strands of the core for the crossover area, but we do have to leave some of the strands in because that's where we get the strength in our rope from. So we leave 4 of those strands in. You can see them coming out of the tapered cover, and then basically we're just going to end up using the cover of the rope basically just as a fid to contain and kind of like a basket fit to contain and organize the strands that get back spliced into the rope. So what I usually do when I do these splices to make it a little bit easier on myself is I'll give myself a pretty longer than recommended distance from mark A to the end of the rope, so that I do have a longer kind of improvised basket fit to work with. Then the next step I'll show you is just back splicing that section back into the rope. You can see none of the cover with the core pieces sticking out of it has been pulled through yet. Right now it'll just kind of sit there, because the next important thing to do with this is you have to milk out all of the slack. Otherwise those won't be fed back in properly. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm gonna milk out as much of the slack as possible for those 4 cores that are the ones that are gonna end up being buried. Because if I don't do that, then they'll get kind of sucked out weird when you set the splice, and then you won't have any strength in your splice. So now that I have it all milked out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut each of those and let them kind of go back into our kind of cover that we're using as the fid. So you cut them off one by one. And then after you cut them off, you can kind of tie a knot in the cover that's sticking out of the back berry, and then girth hitch a core strand on there, just so that you can hook that on something so that it's a little bit easier to pull the cover back through. So now what I'm going to do is pull that cover that contains the 4 cores for the back splice through the rope, and I'll bury it all the way up to mark A on my splice. I'm not going over the whole splice, but you can find all the directions on Teufelberger's website for how to splice Drenaline, and I do the same thing for Drenaline, KMIII Max, and Dragonfly. Just basically adapt them for the different rope constructions. KMIII Max isn't really any different than Drenaline, other than it's just a little bit harder to extract the cores. But yeah, pretty much once we pull that all the way through, then just like a 16 strand splice, you're going to milk the slack out of both of the covers so that you can mark the cores sticking out and then your cover sticking out properly for a taper before you bury everything and finish your splice. So I marked my pieces and tapered the cores and the cover sticking out, and this is probably the most satisfying part of the splice, where you just let it all kind of get sucked back into the rope and make a nice, real nice crossover right there. And you really got to work both ends of the rope to get it all sucked back in. But yeah, it's pretty much very, very similar to a 16 strand splice. The only thing I don't like about Kernmantle splices like this is, other than them not being as strong as, usually not being as strong as the rope on its own, they should at least be stronger than a knot. But the other thing I don't like is that this splice requires the cover to act in a way that is kind of load bearing, because the cover is what's holding the cores against each other and creating friction so that this splice works. But the cover of the rope was never designed to take a load. You can test these splices and they are quite strong. I just, from kind of a theoretical point of view, I feel like it's not the greatest idea we've ever come up with, that the cover is then going to be acting as kind of a important load-bearing part of the rope. I mean, I guess we require it to protect the inner strands of the rope, but I feel like that's not the same as being used to hold the strands against each other to prevent the rope from pulling apart. But they're strong enough and they work pretty good. I use them on these splices on Drenaline, but they don't make me as confident as like a 24 strand splice. But once you finish all of that, you end up with a really nice looking splice. And something people really like about these splices is that the eye flattens down really nice so that you can pull the splice through a zigzag if you do it properly. Thank you so much for watching. This series has been a lot of fun to make, and I'm really excited about some of the other videos we have coming out soon. The video that I'm really excited to work on now is how to climb with tree climbing spikes, how to choose spikes for yourself, and how to adjust them, and some easy mistakes to make when you're spiking, as well as a couple easy quick tips on how to position better when you're spiking up a spar. So thank you so much for watching, and I cannot wait to see you in the next video.
Losing time, I'm fading fast. I just wanna make it last. Try to let go of the past. I close my eyes, embrace the blast. Sleepless nights and headache stack. Restlessness to hell and back. What's my purpose? What do I grab? A slippery surface, a heart attack. And sometimes you just gotta believe there's something that'll give you relief. There's something that'll have what you need.